about to experience, Jackson Snyder presents. We will examine the life of our Master Yeshua by discovering his ancestors, family, and friends, by reviewing rare ancient manuscripts, and speaking to those who know him best. From the Vero Essene Yahad, now experience, Jackson Snyder presents.
Greetings in the name of Yahweh Elohim, our grand creator and father. So without further ado, we are going to go to probably one of the strangest histories you've ever heard. Brother Snyder, he had a pop live event. And first one that comes, they want to talk about Paul, history of Paul. So Brother Snyder, he rides the rabbit this time. He go all over the place. But what come out very interesting, some things you never heard of. We even end up in palace of King Agrippa, of all places. But let me warn you, if you are not willing to listen to history lesson based on sources we have outside Paul's letters, then you need to go and listen to Kiddie Show we do at JS Present. There is quite a series of Kiddie Show about our Messiah and apostles that any child can hear with music and laughter and all kinds of characters. If you're going to get mad, then you need to just not listen to this. On the other hand, understand that our sources are impeccable for what we have to say here.
Acts 13, 1 through 9. Try to find out why Shaul, became Paul. And there really is no indication of why at all. I begin to think that maybe it was because Shaul, in the Hebrew lettering, without the vowels or vowel points, is the same word as Sheol. I don't know whether that might be the reason. Shaul, I understand, means something like powerful, and Paulus in Greek, means something like small and insignificant. It's almost like opposites in name. Shaul and Sheol, the same letters. We got a different vowel point in there. So do you suppose that the disciples that didn't like him were calling him Sheol instead of Shaul?
Well, it would be like our friend Hall. His name's spelled H-A-L-L. But if we had no vowels in this language, he would spell his name H-L-L, and he would call himself Hall. But those people that didn't like him would call him Hell. And this is the same way it is with Shaul and Sheol. Exactly.
There is a lot of, well, I wouldn't say proof, I would say innuendo, especially in the second letter of John and first letter of John, in the little letters, that he's talking about Paul there, and certainly James is talking about Paul when he insults him by calling him an empty man. We find that there's a good reason for calling him an empty man, because Paul indeed calls himself an empty man. But as for this passage, just take a look and see what you think. In the assembly that was in Antioch, there were prophets and teachers. Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Simeon the Black, Lucius the Cyrenian, Manaen, which is the Greek of Menachem, a close friend of Herod the Tetrarch, and Shaul. Here's another connection with the Herodians, Herod Antipas. Herod Agrippa was a nice guy. He was pretty good.
Agrippa was not known as the Tetrarch.
That's true. It has to be Antipas.
As they were ministering to the Master and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Shaul for the work I have called them to." Note that he's called Shaul here. And note that he has a partner named Bar. And note also that we've got a Herod in there, or a friend of the Herods. Then after they had fasted, prayed, and laid hands on them, they sent them off, Paul and Barnabas. And being sent out by the Holy Spirit, they came to Seleucia. Seleucia is in Syria. And from there they sailed to Cyprus. Cyprus, of course, was Barnabas' homeland. Barnabas was a Cypriot.
And so was Sergius Paulus, if you remember.
Then arriving at Salamis, they proclaimed the message of Elohim in the synagogues of the Yehudaim. They also had Yochanan as their assistant. Can you imagine John being an assistant?
They must be talking about Barnabas' nephew, John Mark, not the Gospel John.
He might have been as old as 17 when he began to follow. As you know, they could go at 17. Homeschooling was done. As a man, they had to learn a trade. So whatever their father was up to or whatever their uncle was up to, they had to apprentice with them as well as learn their letters. And then at 17, though, if they had some funds, they were free to go to college. The way they went to college in those days was to go someplace like to Bethabara or Bethany beyond the Jordan to a teacher that they might want to enlist, and for pay, of course. You find a teacher, you pay that teacher, you follow that teacher for 3 years. By that time, you've got your education.
So the point you're making is that John Mark might be going along as apprentice before 17, or to learn a trade after 17. That makes sense. That might also be why Paul didn't want him coming on a later trip.
Undoubtedly, that's the reason that Andrew and Kepha and Philippos and Nathanael were down at Bethany beyond the Jordan, where Yochanan the Dunker was baptizing, looking for a teacher. Why else would they be there? So we're thinking of disciples as being quite young, and I see John here as being a tag-along, a much younger kid. When they had gone through the whole island as far as Paphos, they came across a sorcerer, a Yehudi false prophet, a Nevi Sheker named Bar Yashua. Bar Yashua is the son of Yashua. Keep that name in mind. He was with the proconsul Sergius Paulus. Sergius Paulus is a historical character. There was an obelisk or a stela in Cyprus to him that proclaims his proconsulship, his name and the date. So he really existed. And here he's described as an intelligent man. I guess that means a man that's educated, or a man that has been able to, through his wits, get to a place of a government civil service position as a proconsul. This man summoned Barnabas and Shaul and desired to hear the message of Elohim. But Elymas, the sorcerer, now he's got a new name, for this is the meaning of the name. I don't see Bar Jesus in Elymas at all.
We hardly think that Luke or whoever wrote this knew Hebrew. Obviously he didn't. Elymas does mean nothing like Bar Jesus.
Oh, I have a theory about it. You'll catch on in a minute.
This is the meaning of his name. It's not the meaning of his name. He opposed them and tried to turn the proconsul away from the faith. Then Shaul, also called Paul. This is the switcheroo. And the environment where we find this is most curious. He's filled with the Holy Spirit, stared straight at the sorcerer and said, "You son of Belial, full of all deceit and all fraud, enemy of all righteousness, won't you ever stop perverting the straight paths of Yahweh? His hand is against you. You're going to be blind and will not see the sun for a time." And then, of course, the mist and darkness fell on him. Isn't this reminiscent of the story of Kepha and Simon Magus? not so much from the standpoint of Acts, but certainly from the standpoint of the Nazarene Acts or the Clementines. We find very similar story in there with Peter and Simon Magus. That's smoothed over in the Acts. What we have there is Simon Magus is something of a magician, probably a lower level magician that's coming to try to buy a magic trick. But in the Nazarene Acts and in the historical record, Simon Magus was not a little sorcerer. He was a god. He claimed to be the great god, or the El Elyon. He had a monument erected to his godhood on the road outside of Rome, and people worshipped him and followed him. He had all kinds of secrets. He had all kinds of abilities.
I think I can put a little bit of this together for us. Simon Magus, as you said, considered himself El Elyon, or God Most High, as well as claiming to be the Messiah or the Christ, which would be a perfect match for the title Bar Jesus. Elimos Bar Jesus, indeed, who we are dealing with here, is none other than Simon Magus. In a second appearance in Acts, a bad Simon Magus, not a good Simon Magus, who decides to convert. Actually, the conversion of Simon Magus was to the faith of Yochanan the Dunker. You remember Yochanan died? Simon was gone. Yochanan was succeeded by Dositheus. Simon comes back, intimidates Dositheus, takes over John the Baptist's cult, and Dositheus, he dies under unexplained circumstances. So indeed, this is another case of nickname, code name, surname, alias, pseudonym. And I think I'm putting the pieces together on this other, too. We've got Saul, which is also called Paul. So there is not really a name change here. He had both names. His name was Saulus Paulus. Just like so many other of these people in Acts and Gospel of Luke have two names. More of the game, obviously. And then we have Paul hooked up with a guy named Barnava. We have counterpart, Sergius Paulus. There's a Paul. Hooked up with Bar Jesus. Hooked up with Cyprus. Interestingly enough, Paul's mother's name was Cypros. So there is a connection here between all four of these and the island of Cyprus. Oh, this is a hard one to get one's mind around. But it looks like, at least for the time being, we have the riddle defined. And we've got this Menachem, who is a Herodian. We must remember that Herods married women named Cypros, like Paul's mother, connecting the whole family to Cyprus in some way. Yes, the riddle is defined. We set this out now for geniuses in audience who read the New Testament code, because this is a new conundrum. At least we solve mystery of Paul as Saulus Paulus, knowing that we have a name and a surname. After all, Luke say Paul come from Tarsus. That is a totally Greek city. He pick up name Paulus. But when he in company of Hebrew, he call himself Shaul. But the coupling here of Sergius Paulus and Bar Jesus contrast with Saulus Paulus and Barnava. There's something going on here that we simply haven't got to the bottom of yet, I'm sure.
So I just fleshed the whole thing out, found several more coincidences, and put the whole thing up at the New Testament Code site on a thread. See if we can get any feedback from anybody there, and maybe we can get this riddle solved and go on to the next.
What Luke does is he takes names and situations from Josephus and he mixes them up and he puts them together in new stories in Acts. Why does he do that? Well, he could just be completely dishonest. The other thing is he could be protecting We would like to think that he did this stirring up of names and stirring up of situations and surnames, code names, aliases, because he was trying to protect the families of these people. He had to have written the Acts after, say, 93, because he's dependent on Josephus. One way you can tell that is to look at the story of Kepha and Cornelius, the centurion. Here we got Kepha going to the house of the centurion after a vision. And an angel tells him to go, and an angel also, I think, tells Cornelius that somebody's coming. And all of a sudden, the Gentiles clean, and we've got actually a centurion there that's a kind man that lives close to the synagogue and is helping the Jews out. That is laughable, because those centurions, they were murderers and assassins and killers. They had to keep a group of as many as 100 mercenaries, barbarians, people that they had enlisted out in the land of the barbarians that they were fighting to be part of the Roman legions here and some of the auxiliary legions. And that centurion had to be mean and hard. And when one of his overlords would say, go kill so-and-so, he would have to do that. And also one of the things that the centurions did, if there was a problem among their 100 or so people, is that a culling out. Every 10th man arbitrarily was murdered as a disciplinary action, both in Josephus and Tacitus. That if something went wrong within the centurion's unit, this was the most severe punishment. You would mark out, call out a number from 1 to 10, and it would go clear through all the troops from 1 to 10, and then the centurion would pick a number, and the guy next to him was to kill him. If it's number 5, all number 5s in that troop were going to be killed by number 6. The number 5 guy that was going to get killed couldn't resist. They were strangled or they were slashed with a sword and killed. And that was a lesson to the rest of the century. But look, here we have a nice guy with an Italian name. Cornelius means horn, like a horn of plenty, or a trumpet. A corne is a trumpet in Italian. In Josephus, we have the story of Simon, whom Josephus says had an assembly of sectarians in Jerusalem. He was the head of an assembly. Yeah, I know you're going to hear this story again. I'll tell you why, because I'm fascinated with it. And we have Josephus telling us that Simon, the head of this sectarian assembly, I wonder what it was in Jerusalem. I wonder what it was. And preaching against the ways of Herod Agrippa. Now, as you maybe know, Herod Agrippa, if there was ever a good Herod, that was as close as one got. He didn't last long in the kingship. He died unexpectedly in 44 AD. You remember he put on a suit that was shining in the sun, and they began to hail him as a god. And the scripture says that he died right there and was eaten up of worms.
We might add here, Brother Snyder, that Herod Agrippa receives excellent reviews from Josephus, from Philo, from Jewish Encyclopedia, from almost every source as being a Torah keeper, a very generous and compassionate man, an excellent ruler, always in trouble with Rome because of his willingness to be gracious unto his people and other rulers in area. Really, the only bad press he got is from New Testament. Acts 12. See, he was eaten by worms, but it appears that he certainly was poisoned. The coming on of his distress in 44 AD and the events of the next 5 days appear to me to be the work of Locusta, the poisoner. Rome did not like him being so generous and kind to his people. And certainly a story of him inviting Simon into his palace is true, and I think it is. Then indeed this is the most gracious of all the Herods, whom we might hope would have lasted another 20, 30 years, so as to moderate the attitudes of the Jews and Romans leading up to first rebellion. So, hats off to King Herod Agrippa the Great. May we see him prominently in the Millennium Kingdom.
I think that is a little bit of confusion with Herod the Great. That's what happened to Herod the Great, but it says that it happened here to Agrippa too. Agrippa was a king who was on the run his whole life. If you don't mind me going off on another tangent, though he was in the family of the Herods and grew up in Rome and grew up in the palace in Rome, he was a fellow that could not resist spending money. He was a compulsive spender. And when he spent all his money, he began to borrow money from every place, all his rich friends, to the point where he had to go into exile because of it. And what he wanted to do finally was make it all right with all his creditors, and so he decided, I'm going to go up and speak to the emperor, Tiberius Caesar, who I grew up with him. I know the guy that's supposed to be his successor. That's Caligula. Agrippa and Caligula were friends in their young times. And so he goes up to Tiberius in Rome, who's a sour old man, but he doesn't know what has happened in the meantime between Tiberius and him. Something happened. When he was a youth, Agrippa was in a chariot with Caligula. You know, Caligula was the next emperor after Tiberius.
And off we go on another rabbit trail.
Caligula's parents were Germanicus, the great general that Tiberius had murdered. Who was Tiberius' stepson. He had him murdered because he was so popular. Tiberius thought, I'm going to lose the emperorship here to Germanicus. He was called Germanicus because he was the conqueror of Germania, Germany. And he was well known in the empire. Everybody loved him. And he was extremely popular as a contender for the next imperial spot. He was married to a woman named Agrippina, who was of the Julian clan, a very steadfast, loyal woman, and they had children. They had 3 children. One's name was Gaius. That's Caligula, the maddest emperor that ever lived. Caligula was a nickname. When he was a boy, Gaius was with his father in Germany on the campaign to destroy the German tribes up there and to bring order to that area of the country so that they could exploit it for taxes. And Caligula wore the boots of the army, even as a boy. And he was just the darling of the soldiers. They're marching along with them in boots way too big for him. What those boots were called, those army boots, were Caligula's. So Caligula means little boot. And he kept that name. He had a sister who was also called Agrippina, after the mother. Is this important? Yeah, it's important for the next part of this. Agrippina, the sister of Caligula, and then there was another sister. What was her name? Julia, I think. Julia, Caligula, and Julia were in an incestuous relationship all their time growing up. But little Agrippina was not. So they grew up, and Caligula becomes the emperor. Julia goes to the Vestal Virgins, and little Agrippina marries a man of the equestrian class named Ahenobarbus. Domitian Ahenobarbus. Little Agrippina has a child by Ahenobarbus. Ahenobarbus, by the way, means Redbeard. That child's name was also Domitian Ahenobarbus, named after his father. He didn't like that name, especially Domitian. So he told his mother, I'm not going to be called that. Don't call me that anymore. I want to be called Nero. So Agrippina the younger was the mother of Nero, and when she got rid of Ahenobarbus, she was able to talk her uncle, who by this time was emperor, right after her brother was emperor and was assassinated, her uncle Claudius, to marry her. And it seems like the marriage of the niece was in vogue at that time, and Agrippina married Claudius and talked him in to, instead of having his own son to be the heir, she talked him into taking Nero on as the heir. And when he finally did that, she poisoned his son, whose name was Britannicus, so that there was no way Britannicus could ascend instead of her son Nero. And then when she finish that up, she poisoned Claudius with a mushroom, so he died. And that was just the beginning of a career of Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, poisoning all those that she considered enemies or threats, and even the women that were her friends that got too close to either Claudius or her son Nero. She was a poisoner. There was a famous poison maker in Rome in prison. Her name was Locusta, and she could make poisons of every type that you touch them to your lips and you're dead, or they might poisons that would make you linger for some time. We've got Nero now set up to be not only the emperor at the age of 17, but also got him set up to become the head of the first beast in Revelation 13.
Well, beloved, we have to take a little break now. We'll be back when it's finished, promise. Just as I promised, Jackson Snyder Present is back now.
And the fifth head of the beast in Revelation 17, of the 8 heads, 10 horns, 8 heads, Nero was the fifth head. Now we go back to the assembly in Jerusalem. When Caligula was young, he was friends with Agrippa, Herod Agrippa. They grew up together, and they were riding in a chariot one day, and they had a slave who was driving the chariot.
Again, Brother Snyder, I interrupt you to tell you slave name, Eutychus. Eutychus. Another borrowing from Josephus, I wonder? The boy that fall out of balcony in the book of Acts?
Yes, more nicknames, code names, surnames, aliases, and pseudonyms.
And Agrippa had made a comment to Caligula. He said, look, one of these days you're going to be the emperor. The old man's got to die first. Let's toast to that. Let's toast to the death of Tiberius. The slave went back and told Tiberius. So when Agrippa went up there to try to get some money from him, he didn't get money, but he went to jail instead. Tiberius put him in prison. Now, Agrippa was royalty, but he owed money everywhere. In the prison, there was a prophet who was blind, and Tiberius was standing around in the prison, and this fellow, this blind prophet, approached him. He said, Agrippa, don't worry. Something's going to happen that is going to bring you back to the fullness of your power, and you will end up being the king of all of Palestine. And when this prophecy comes true, don't forget me. My name is so-and-so. Don't forget me. The prophecy did come true, but there was one other piece of the prophecy, and that was that during that time that he was giving the prophecy in prison, an owl came down, a particular type of owl. And the prophet said, this one thing I have to tell you. When you see the owl again, that you'll be dead the next day. And sure enough, Tiberius finally dies when Caligula puts the pillow over his face. Caligula becomes emperor. He releases his friend Agrippa, pays off his debts, takes the rest of the Herods out of their positions in Palestine, and puts him in as king of the whole thing. It did all come to pass. So that's how Agrippa got there. But when that happened, Agrippa remembered that scene in the prison, made sure that he got out and got prosperous. He became one of his sidekicks, like a shroom cough. He became a sidekick. Now we get back to the assembly. We had to set up the whole history here and get Nero in. So Agrippa calls on Simon, who's been criticizing him from, I'm thinking it's the Nazarene assembly. What else will there be there? What else is it going to be? It's going to be Simon Kepha. Let me jump to a conclusion. Agrippa would normally, those Herodian kings would take somebody like that, a little pipsqueak, a religious guy, criticizing him for breaking the Torah, and just have him executed. Nothing to it. But that's not what happened with Simon. Agrippa sends a messenger to Simon's house. Does this sound a little familiar? The messenger he sends is a general. The general's name, Cornelius.
I'm afraid I have to correct you here a little bit. Cornelius is not sent to Kepha, but Cornelius is mentioned in same paragraph, and there are actually 2 Cornelius in Josephus' Antiquities. So it is still another, as how you say it, nickname, surname, code name, alias, pseudonym. Shroomkov, how are you knowing all this?
Well, sir, not so hard to know when you have book open to where you're talking about.
Oh, I get it.
Inviting Simon to spend the day with King Agrippa in order to see firsthand how Agrippa's life broke Torah. The contention by Agrippa was that it didn't, that he was a Torah observer, and that he didn't have houses full of idols, but that he had to entertain dignitaries from all over the place in all different religions, and of course, because of that, he had to be cognizant and sensitive to the dignitaries that he received. Cornelius takes Simon to the palace to see Agrippa. I'm really getting into Paul, aren't I? Simon spends the day with Agrippa, and when he leaves, Agrippa sets him up with all kinds of gifts and money for the assembly. And Josephus tells us that was the end of Simon's criticism of King Agrippa. Was it because of the gifts? I don't think so. I think Agrippa was a good guy. So Simon quits, Agrippa goes on to practice the faith insofar as he could, and then the owl comes. And sure enough, Agrippa dies, but according to the scripture, of course, he dies because people adulate him as a god, which I kind of doubt that. I think that the writer of that is mixed up with Herod the Great, not Agrippa. And then coming forth as the next king is another 17-year-old, and that is Agrippa II, who's not religious. And we find Agrippa II in the book of Acts as an acquaintance of Paul, with his sister Berenice, and his other sister, what was her name? I can't believe you don't remember.
Drusilla.
What does that have to do with Paul? Well, okay, let's go to Paul now. We got Nero through this long explanation. We got him in the imperial seat. Now, I did a lecture on the letters between Paul and Seneca, the philosopher and poet. I was trying to explain this last night a little bit. These letters of Paul are not in the scripture. And of course, they've been denied as being authentic by the Catholic Church. This is another case where, when you read history and know what was going on insofar as you can know at that time, and then you read the letters between Paul and Seneca, they are extremely revealing. Obviously, they're friends. The letters that go back are full of compliments one to the other. I don't even know if they ever met, but in the letters, they're always saying how they want to meet and what a reunion it will be and how wonderful it will be to get two intellects together that are so close. And Seneca, who is institutionally educated, marvels at Paul because he says Paul does not have any kind of formal education. Paul has sent to Seneca his letters to the Corinthians, Galatians, and a couple other are mentioned that we don't have. Now, I told you about Agrippina the poisoner, the mother of Nero. Well, when Nero is a little squirt, she thinks the best thing that she can do for her son, who's already showing signs of being a psychopath, is to get the greatest philosopher in the history of Rome to become his teacher and guardian. Why would he want to do that, Seneca, when he was called on to do it? Well, he wouldn't want to do that because he was in exile. He'd been put away on the Isle of Pandateria, where nobody lives very long, and here's the great ethicist, philosopher, and poet Seneca pining away. Agrippina, once she poisons her husband, Emperor Claudius, with a mushroom, she sees to the release of Seneca under one condition: if he will take on the guardianship of her psychopathic son. What's his choice? Of course he will. Paul. Oh yeah, Paul. So Seneca writes to Paul. He compliments Paul highly for the high level of philosophy and religion and ethics he finds in these letters that he has acquired from Paul. Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, and some other ones we never heard of. And so Seneca writes to Paul, I am so enamored with your letters that I have decided to share them with our esteemed emperor and his wife Poppaea. And he talks about him sharing this Pauline-style Christian faith with Nero and Poppaea, whoever else is there. And he says, they are not greatly disposed to your philosophy. But I'm sure if I continue to read it to them, discuss it with them, they will find it to be of ethical purity and consider it to be a philosophy that's worth living living for. Just give me a chance. Paul writes back and says, please don't do that. Don't. Paul writes a couple letters. Please don't share it. And Seneca writes back, well, they're seeming to be more hostile to it, right? We have to remember that religion was completely illegal. And the penalty for practicing that religion, whether it was Paul's gospel or Jesus' gospel, was the same. If they wanted to punish it, what was on the books was strangling, head chopping, or burning. Notice that Paul talks about Priscilla and Aquila, who risked their necks for me. So Paul writes the letter to the Romans, which is a theological treatise that explains what he means when he says, my gospel. And he adds into that the names of a plethora of people who he greets in Rome, and including a few people that are high up in the imperial court, not to mention female deaconesses, female apostles. He mentions King Herod Agrippa's brother, Aristobulus, Herodian, who was Aristobulus' son, Herod V, and he calls them kinspeople, cousins. One person he doesn't mention there, of course, is Aristobulus' wife, Salome, that danced before the previous Herod Antipas, and as a reward for dancing, she received the head of John the Baptist. So Paul's greeting that family. Paul has never been to Rome by this time. He hadn't been there before. He's writing this to them previous to a visit there, so they'll understand his theology. We don't know who started that assembly of Gentiles in Rome. There were two of them in Rome. There was St. Peter's and St. Paul's. I mean, they weren't called that at the time, but there was a Jewish assembly and there was a Gentile assembly. So Nero, he burns Rome down because he wants to remake it into Neropolis. And when the people suspect that it was their own emperor that burned the whole city down, killed thousands and thousands of people, and destroyed almost 3/4 of the city, the people turn on Nero. He's got to find a scapegoat. He comes up with these Christians. How does he know about them? He wouldn't know about them. They could be running rampant in Rome. Nero was too busy having illicit sex and orgies with men, boys, and women, and going out at night and mugging people. That's what he did for pleasure, mugging people at night. He would know nothing about these people, especially not to call them Christianoi. He would have called them Jews, if anything. That's what everybody else in Rome at this time was calling Christians, Jews. He calls them Christians. What does Paul call them? Christianoi. Where does Nero learn about that religion in the first place? He learns it from Seneca, his guardian, who's reading the letters to him. He's not disposed toward it. He and Poppaea have to find a scapegoat. Wow! Is the light turning on now? So they scapegoat the Christians. And you probably know the horrible persecution that came out of that, to the point where Nero was using Christians as streetlights, putting them up on poles, putting some gas on them and lighting them up. Even, he had a party even at his own palace and the Neronic gardens in the back. He brought people who had survived the fire that were living back there. And he lit his own gardens up where all these refugees from the fire were living with Christians' bodies on poles. It's outrageous. Seneca writes to Paul. He says, I realize that terrible things are happening to your group, persecutions and death. Seneca turns on Nero, of course, calls him some names in the letter to Paul, but he says, Paul, I assure you, as long as I'm alive, you and your friends will have an advocate here and you'll have nothing to worry about. So Seneca's trying to give him some hope as far as maybe rescinding this persecution, and if not, certainly Seneca will be an advocate for Paul and his people, especially those named in the letters of the Romans and the Corinthians and the Philippians and 1 Timothy. But then what happens is a total disaster. Nero commands Seneca to open his veins. Seneca is a real old man by this. Seneca pleads, I'll make you the heir to my fortunes, I'll do this and that, but Nero won't relent. He says, old friend, I appreciate all you've done for me all your life, but your time has come. Go home and slit your veins. That's what Seneca does, and his wife does it too. So they've slit their veins, but Seneca is so old that his blood doesn't pour out, it just kind of oozes out. And so what he has to do is have his servants to get the blood flowing somehow. They put him in hot boiling bath to get the blood flowing to kill him, and finally, if they didn't boil him to death, he dies of lack of blood. Fortunately, his wife, they're able to catch her in time and bind her up, and she's okay. But Seneca's dead. There's no intermediary for Paul here. The persecution rages on. Now, here's the conclusion. Do you suppose that all those people in those letters, and Paul himself, all were killed, along with all the Christians that were burnt up on account of Seneca's readings of Paul's letters to Nero and his insistence on Nero paying attention to it? Look, in the letters, Nero has all kinds of suspects. He has a senator. He has Druid royalty in the letters. Nero has his secretary in the letters in Philippians 2. Nero has Herodian royalty in his letters. Plus lots of apostles and deacons, deaconesses, and common people. Right there we have a list of about 50 people that Nero can turn over to Tigellinus, his enforcer. Tigellinus was a psychopathic maniac. He did the bidding of Nero, killed hundreds of people on his behalf, and would also engage in all kinds of the filthiest perversion you can imagine. Tacitus and Cassius Dio and Suetonius, they all write about this very candidly. Paul himself ends up on the chopping block out on the Antium Road, where they have recently found the remains of Paul. They found his bones out on the Antium Road underneath what was known as the St. Paul's Place. Think of the possibility. Nero's secretary was also Paul's secretary, a fellow named Epaphroditus. We read about him several times in the letters of Paul, especially in Philippians 2. He's also known as Epaphras, same person. Paul writes about his great friend Epaphroditus. He says he's sick in Rome. He needs prayer. Paul calls on, in his letters, the believers all over to be praying for Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus was a slave of Nero, that Nero freed under the condition that Epaphroditus, a man of great education and of great wisdom, would be one of his advisors and the secretary of his correspondence. Epaphroditus is spared for this reason. Epaphroditus is obviously a Christian believer and a lawbreaker, but he's spared because of something strange, a fluke that happened. And this is it. When the people finally realized that the Christians had nothing to do with burning the town down, they go after Nero again. They storm the palace. By this time, Poppaea's gone. Nero's kicked her to death. He has replaced her with a boy named Sporus, married the boy, who looked like Poppaea. Nero also had married two others in this time. He married a gladiator as big as Goliath. He was a wife to the gladiator, can't remember his name. He was a husband to the boy, Nah, maybe. This was a manly. He was a gladiator, for crying out loud. He killed people in the arena. Nero married him. He's 7 foot tall. He was a wife to the gladiator, a husband to Sporus the boy, and he married the sister of Claudius's first wife, who he had killed, named Messalina. She was a harlot. So he had, besides Poppaea, who he killed, and his first wife, what was her name? Can't remember.
Octavia was her name.
Here he's got the baggage of a boy, a man, and a woman he's married to. And so what Nero does is he gets a hold of Epaphroditus and he says, "Get me out of here." They go out of the palace by the back and they go through the woods and they go through people's yards and they try to make their way over to Epaphroditus' little house, which they do. They make their way there. This is how Epaphroditus avoids being murdered, like all the rest that were in Nero's court that were Christians. Epaphroditus suggests to Nero, there's only one way for you to go. If they get you, they're going to tear you limb from limb. You've got to kill yourself. Take a great man's way out. Nero says, what a shame it is that the world is going to lose one of its greatest artists. And he makes an attempt with a short sword to kill himself, but he can't. So he enlists Epaphroditus. Kill me. Epaphroditus says, I'll help you. And the story goes that they were in Epaphroditus' garage or basement. Epaphroditus held the instrument, and when Nero tried to fall on it, Epaphroditus shoved it in to his head. Thus in Revelation 13, we see the number of his name, Kaisaron, Neron. We see the means of his death, a head wound. And then Nero's body disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to it. But Revelation 13 says the head wound was healed. Nero's begin to pop up all over the world. In Parthia, Nero's in Greece. Nero's popping up in Europe, and they're all gathering armies to go back to Rome and take back the empire ship. Did Nero die? If he died, then what sprung up out of the earth were lookalikes that had all the same talents and personalities of Nero, that fooled his enemy, the Parthians, his friends, the Greeks, and even the Europeans, who fooled these populations who knew Nero into thinking Nero had popped up in their country. The head wound was healed. It was healed with what's called the legend of Nero Redivivus, living again. All right, so the story ends 30 years later. Got a new emperor on the throne of a different dynasty. Funny, it's a man with the same first name as Nero, Domitian. His father is Vespasian. His brother was Titus, the two generals that Nero sent down to Palestine to burn down Israel and destroy Jerusalem and flatten the temple. As a result of the prophecy from the Olivet discourses and the apocalyptic history of the time that John was living, of the destruction of Jerusalem, and that's what Revelation is all about. It's not about the future, it's about what was happening then. Domitian comes on the scene, and he considers himself to be the priest of morality, except there's been something terrible happening in his household and among his kin. And that is, by this time, the 90s, his kin have all converted to one form or another of Christianity. And that absolutely infuriates him, because he is a priest of the goddess Minerva, and it is Minerva that he is trying to get to become the deity of the entire empire. He was a moral fanatic, except when it came to himself. He's the one that murdered his brother Titus by putting him in an icebox. So we find again in Revelation 17, head number 6, the one who is, it's a historical marker. The Revelator says 5 have come, 1 is. The 6th is, that's Vespasian. And then there's a 7th who's here just a short while. That's Titus, the son of Vespasian, brother of Domitian. He served for about a year, a little over a year, before he was shut up in the icebox by his younger brother. And then there was an 8th who belonged to the 7th. Well, he belonged to the 7th because they were brothers, and close brothers. And he's an 8th, and he goes to perdition. That number 8 shares in the imperfection of the number 666. They considered Domitian, after all those false Neros, as the new Nero, who had come back from the dead because of the persecution again of Christians and Jews. 8 shares in 666. If you know a little about mathematics, if you take 8 factorial and the sum of that, and then factorialize the sum, you get 666. It was an old numbers riddle. If you don't know what I'm talking about and are interested in that, I'll show you sometime. It's meant to, by the Revelator calling him an 8th, and it goes to perdition. The going to perdition is the end of the resurrected Nero as well. Domitian becomes destroyed. You'll never guess who destroyed Domitian. He was murdered in his bedroom in a plot hatched by Clement's wife, Domitilla. Yeah, I'm talking about Clement of the Nazarene Acts, of the Clementine epitomes, of 1st and 2nd Clement. Clement, his name was Flavius. He was one of the cousins of the Flavian family that was on the throne, a cousin of Domitian, Sabinus, Titus, and Domitian. Because they had murdered Clement, Domitian murdered Clement. Domitian's valet, Stephen.
Obviously, another Josephine, nickname, surname, codename, alias, pseudonym,
was a secret Christian. Instead of murdering Clement's wife, Domitian sent her to Pandateria, the island of no return. She was able to get back, and her and Stephen plotted the death of Domitian. We're talking about Clement's wife, Domitilla. This is amazing. So it was Stephen the valet. Domitian always kept a dagger under his pillow. Stephen took the dagger out from under his pillow and stabbed him to death. Domitian was able to do one more thing the day or so before his death, his perdition as predicted in Revelation 17. He was able to do away with one more Christian, a man who had served the empire for his whole life. A man who had served Nero beyond the call of duty 30 years before. A man who was Paul's secretary named Epaphroditus. He brought Epaphroditus up and had him executed. What for? For being a Christian? No. For murdering Nero 30 years before. Is that crazy or what? And with the death of Domitian, that ended the persecution of the Christians. But I got the whole story recorded here, and I only lost, 17 or 18 people in the course of it. The Paul stuff, yeah, go out and listen to that. There's more out there on JS Presents. I wanted to get into Paul's secular life, but I'm glad we did this instead so I could get the whole story on tape. Don't be afraid to speculate. Speculate and let me know about it. What you think? The end of the Domitian was the end of the double Neronic persecution, the tribulation, the destruction of Jerusalem, the day of Yahweh. All that had passed away. That age was gone. A new century had just come in. Oh, by the way, Domitian got Josephus too, we assume on the count of being a Christian. But a new century was afoot with new emperors, no dynasties, but some people that had some sense for a change. Why were these emperors in the first century so crazy? Well, besides the possibility that they were all related and they were the products of incestuous relations, think of this. What did they make the pipes in the palace out of in those days? And the water tanks?
Certainly, my friend, we will find the answer there.
Lead.
That's VEROYAHAD.org. Contact me, your host, Jackson Snyder, by email at veroyahad@gmail.com or catch us all on Facebook.
Hello, all my friends, and welcome to this installment of Jackson Snyder Presents, brought to you by the Veroyahad and Hebrew Nation Radio, and we are so happy to be on because we have such good news for you today. War is done. War is over. That's what they proclaim at end of Vietnam War here in States. And my friend tell me about this. He look for end of this war because he up for draft, which means they come take you away, put you in Vietnam on front line to be cannon fodder, especially at end of war. They killing 500 Americans a day. All these Americans stuck away in Laos and Cambodia and North Vietnam and Hanoi Hilton, being tortured. It was day of great tribulation, and my friends here, Brother Jack and Brother Lee and Brother Mike, all were up for draft. None have to go though, thank goodness, because I don't think these fellows would be able to live even the average lifespan of new recruit on front line, that is 7 seconds. If you live 7 seconds on front line, that means you lived a whole lifespan. These fellows here, they are not fighters, except with the sword of the tongue. Now they will fight false prophets, and they will fight those people who are doing wrong, and they will have no end of it until fight is over, enemy the devil is defeated, and that is good news. So they escape Hanoi Hilton to be here to fight another day when they are old men. And this is what this program is all about, some good news for you. We're going to speak about tribulation. Now, how could that be good news? The good news is everybody think it coming up anytime, but we can tell you with proof, positive from Scripture, it long done. Long done. There's nothing to fear from great tribulation or any of these bad-mouthing fellows on YouTube who tell you over and over again, dig hole in backyard, go hide in mountain, buy my food. Yes, buy my survival food, buy as much as you can. Buy my survival kits. Buy you a pack so you can get away fast when Chinese or National Guard come to your house, kill your dog, kill your child. You have to run fast, go to railroad, jump on railroad car, and go to Buffalo. Yes, Buffalo, New York, the paradise on earth I keep telling you about, where I will spend eternity, because they have pizza there and ice cream and lots of friends from old country up there. They got this place called Chickawaga. I like that name. It must be a great place. They have Lake Ontario. They're close to Canada. Oh, well, I'm getting off subject again, but it's good news for you if we can show you the Great Tribulation all done. You know, in this world you will have tribulation, but there's only one great tribulation, and that is on day of Yahweh, which has come and which has gone. Did you know that Christians in church keep 65 to 87% of Torah? Yes, we go over the Torah commandments and we see churches do teach that you keep 65, some up to 87%. That's good news too, because such that keep Torah are righteous people. If you can keep Torah perfectly, I would like to know you, because you are a holy person, you have Christian perfection. But if you can keep 87%, and then the Torah of Yahshua, which is even stricter than Torah in Old Testament, then you are a perfect man. But most of us not perfect men. We try, as the Apostate Paul tells us. We work out salvation with fear and trembling, and I do this every day as I think about the resurrection of the dead, and then I don't think about it anymore because that is such good news I get happy. Well, Brother Snyder wants to tell you about the tribulation, and he wants to prove to you that you have nothing to worry about there. We have this special guest that's going to just tell us how we ought to feel about the Great Tribulation, and he coming on right now. It's my Father's world. The birds their carols raise, the morning light, the lily bright, to declare their Maker's praise. This is my Father's world. The battle is not done. Yahshua who died will be satisfied, and heaven and earth will be one. Here's Brother Snyder.
The Great Tribulation, is it future or is it fulfilled? There is a multitude of fear-mongers or ignorant teachers that you can pick up on every corner of Facebook and YouTube that will scare you to death with every kind of threat in regards to the little passage in Scripture that speaks of a great tribulation, except it says the Great Tribulation. Let me correct myself. The is referring to one Great Tribulation. There are many tribulations, and the tribulation period started for us when our faith was born. It's been tribulation after tribulation for 2,000 years. We move into it, we move out of it. Nations move into it, and they move out of it. Some nations that worship stones and wood figures and animals move into it, and they never move out of it. Are you in great tribulation now? I would say that we are enjoying at this time a golden age. You might not like the politics. You might not like world affairs. You might not like your neighbors. You might be fearful of any of these things, and therefore latch on to the idea that surely the great tribulation is soon to be upon us. And in the mail I get, many people are scared to death, especially those who are secular people that have heard about this great tribulation, primarily from Christians or survivalists or false teachers. And they know just enough about it to buy into the idea, because they hate the world, that it's about to happen here. And that when it happens here, it will be the result of the retribution of the Almighty Father in heaven, and we will deserve it because we as a nation are so sinful. It's interesting to me to look into the definition of sin in 1 John 3:4, sin being the transgression of the Torah. And since this is still a Christian nation, and you can hardly argue with that when 40% or more of all people go to church regularly, those same people, 87% of the Torah is fulfilled by them by being Christians and following church doctrine. 65 to 87% of Torah is fulfilled. Now that's better than Israel ever did. Yes, there are sinners here and big sinners. Yes, there is perversion here and there's perversion everywhere in the world. As long as we're in this world, there will be perversion and sin, racism, sexism, prejudice, and classism. But the Christians that I know are satisfied with their lot, patriotic toward their country, yet while remaining in that 65 to 87% of keeping Torah, because they believe, rightly so, that they will be protected by the Father, and even if they fall victim, they will be redeemed. I want to look at the Great Tribulation today in hopes that I can change your mind. If you are fearful, and if you are just simply dogmatic, you don't have to listen to this. I put a warning on it for you because you'll never change your mind. You will never try to understand Scripture rightly because your heart is hardened. And a heart hardened by stone of religion is one of the hardest hearts to warm and soften. Matthew writes the words of Yeshua in 24, 21, and 22, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be rescued. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. And mark, for in those days shall be affliction, such as was not from the beginning of the creation that God created unto this time, neither shall be. And except that the Master had shortened those days, no flesh should be rescued. But for the elect's sake, whom he has chosen, he hath shortened the days." That's in 13, 19, and 20. Let's go to the other gospel. Luke, "For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled." He's talking about the day of Yahweh, prophesied by the great prophets, to be the retribution upon Israel and Jerusalem. "For there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles." That's in 21, 22 through 24. Unless we completely ignore the setting, it's evident that the tribulation mentioned here is that which was to come upon the people of Jerusalem and Judea. Tribulation which would result in the destruction of the city and temple. As we've seen, Yahshua spoke of various things that would come to pass first. Wars, famines, pestilences, earthquakes. None of these would be the sign of the impending desolation, but when they would see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then they would know that the desolation was nigh, and they should flee to the mountains. Why? "For then shall be great tribulation," wrote Matthew. Luke's account says, "For then shall be great distress in the land," that is Judea, "and wrath upon this people," that is the Judahites. "And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles." According to the Scriptures, the great tribulation of which Messiah spoke was to bring great affliction, distress, and wrath upon the Judahites, and destruction upon their city and temple. Josephus, the Jewish historian who was an eyewitness to these events, wrote a full and detailed account of the tribulation that fell upon that land and people in and prior to 70 AD. His account, Wars of the Jews, was published about 75 AD, at a time when the events of which he wrote were still fresh in the memory of thousands. Since he was not a Christian, no one can accuse him of slanting his material so as to match the prophecy Messiah had given.
agreement. Nevertheless, the history he recorded fully confirms the fulfillment of the prophecy Yahshua gave about the great tribulation which came upon that land and people. The reference I'll give in this chapter are from Josephus, who was there. The trouble in Jerusalem began over differences between the Jews and the Romans. Some of the Jews felt they should revolt against Roman rule. Others felt they should refrain from such actions and hoped that a peaceful agreement could be reached. The Jews who favored revolt became very violent and began to kill those who disagreed with them. Troops were sent out to control the mob. War was on, not only at Jerusalem, but throughout the land. Trouble broke out. Every city was divided into two armies, Josephus says, and the preservation of the one part was in the destruction of the other. So the daytime was spent in shedding blood, and the night in fear, which was of the two the more terrible. It was then common to see cities filled with dead bodies, still lying unburied, those of old men mixed with infants, all dead and scattered about together. Women also lay amongst them, without any covering for their nakedness. You might then see the whole province full of inexpressible calamities, while the dead of still more barbarous practices which were threatened was everywhere greater than what had been already perpetrated. The Jews in Alexandria that revolted against the Romans, that's in Egypt, by the way, were destroyed unmercifully, and this, their destruction, was complete. Houses were first plundered of what was in them, and then set on fire by the Romans, wherein no mercy was shown to infants, and no regard had to the aged, but they went on in the slaughter of persons of every age, till all the place was overflowed with blood, and 50,000 of them lay dead upon heaps. In 1 hour, over 20,000 were killed in Caesarea, and the battle continued until, quote, all Caesarea was empty of its Jewish inhabitants. Galilee was all over filled with fire and blood, nor was it exempted from any kind of misery or calamity, unquote. Such horror was in the land that one prominent man, in order to save his family from a worse fate, took a sword and killed first his aged father and mother, his wife and children, all submitting to it willingly, and then took his own life. In Jerusalem, those of the revolting party were known as zealots. They, quote, fell upon the people who disagreed with them as upon a flock of profane animals and cut their throats, unquote. In this way, 12,000 more eminent inhabitants perished. Quote, the terror that was upon all the people was so great that no one had courage enough either to weep openly for the dead man that was related to him or bury him. Those that mourned for others soon underwent the same death with those whom they mourned for, unquote. The slaughter continued until, I quote, the outer temple was all of it overflowed with blood, and that day they saw 8,500 dead bodies there. Included in this number were those that a little before had worn the sacred garments and presided over the public worship, which were cast out naked to be the food of dogs and wild beasts, unquote. Even those who came with sacrifices were slain, quote, and sprinkled that altar with their own blood, till the dead bodies of strangers were mingled together with those of their own country, and those of profane persons with those of priests, and the blood of all sorts of dead carcasses stood in lakes in the holy courts themselves. The noise also of those that were fighting was incessant, both day and night, but the lamentations of those that mourned exceeded the other. Their calamities came perpetually, one upon another, but for the seditious themselves they fought against each other, while they trod upon the dead bodies as they lay heaped one upon the other, and taking up a mad rage from those dead bodies that were under their feet, became the fiercer thereupon, and when they had resolved upon anything, they executed it without mercy, and omitted no method of torment or of barbarity. Unquote. No wonder Yeshua said, daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but for yourselves and for your children, knowing that all these things would come upon that generation. Yeshua had said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And surely this was true of Jerusalem. Many Jews were killed by Jews, not by the enemy outside the walls. Josephus says that the Jews never suffered from the Romans anything worse than they made each other suffer. Such madness and insanity shows the validity of Yeshua's words when he likened that generation to a man who becomes demon-possessed, so that his latter state is worse than the first. As Jerusalem became surrounded by Romans, food became scarce within the walls of the city. Many of the Jews went by night in the valleys to search for food. These were caught, I quote, tormented with all sorts of torture, and then crucified in the sight of those on the walls, unquote. About 500 every day were thus killed until the number finally became so great that there was not room enough for the crosses, nor enough crosses for the victims. Often several were nailed to the same torture stake. Imagine the torment of those who would see or hear their loved ones being thus tortured a short distance from the walls, and many had their hands cut off, I quote. Then did the famine widen its progress and devour the people by whole houses and families. The upper rooms were full of women and children dying by famine, and the lanes of the city were full of the dead bodies of the ages. A kind of deadly night had seized upon the city. Thus did the miseries of Jerusalem grow worse and worse every day. The multitude of carcasses that lay in heaps, one upon another, was a horrible sight and produced pestilential stench. And I continue to quote Josephus, the number of those that perished by famine in the city was prodigious, and their miseries were unspeakable. For if so much as the shadow of any kind of food did appear anywhere, a war was commenced presently, and the dearest friends fell fighting one another about it. Children pulled the very morsel that their fathers were eating out of their very mouths. And what was still more to be pitied, so did the mothers do to their infants. And when those that were almost dead were perishing under their hands, they were not ashamed to take from them the very last drops that might preserve their lives. The seditious also invented terrible methods of torment to discover where any food was, and they were these: to stop up the passages of the privy parts of the miserable wretches, and to drive sharp stakes up their fundaments, and a man was forced to bear what is terrible even to hear. Unquote. One woman of prominence killed her infant son and roasted it. After eating half the body, the other half was hid. Shortly after this, certain seditious Jews came to search her house. When they smelled the scent of roasted flesh, they threatened to cut her throat immediately if she didn't show them what food she had prepared. She then uncovered the remaining half of the little body, saying, "Come, eat of this food, for I have eaten of it myself. Do not you pretend to be either more tender than a woman or more compassionate than a mother." But even those hardened men were horrified at the sight and left the house trembling. Surely these things were fulfillment of the warning that had been given centuries before. Yahweh shall bring a nation against thee from afar, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates until thy high and fenced walls come down. And thou shalt eat the fruit of thine own body, the flesh of thy sons and of thy daughters, the tender and delicate woman among you, which would not adventure to set the sole of her foot upon the ground for delicateness and tenderness. Her eye shall be evil toward her young one that cometh from between her feet, and toward her children which she shall bear. For she shall eat them for want of all things secretly in the siege and straitness, wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee in thy gates. Deuteronomy 28:49-57. Some who tried to escape from the city after it had been surrounded by the Roman armies swallowed pieces of gold in order to take them unnoticed. Word got out that such a thing was being done, and many of those who tried to escape were cut open by the enemy to see if they had swallowed any gold.
You are listening to Jackson Snyder Presents on Hebrew Nation Radio. We'll be right back after these important announcements.
Jackson Snyder Presents has returned just as we promised.
Some who tried to escape from the city after it had been surrounded by the Roman armies swallowed pieces of gold in order to take them unnoticed. Word got out that such a thing was being done, and many of those who tried to escape were cut open by the enemy to see if they had swallowed any gold. Quote, "Nor does it seem to me that any misery befell the Jews that was more terrible than this, since in one night about 2,000 of these deserters were thus dissected." Unquote. Finally, the Roman armies broke through the wall, and an enraged soldier caught the temple afire. Quote, "While the holy house was on fire, everything was plundered that came to hand, and 10,000 of those that were caught were slain. Nor was there a commiseration of any age or any reverence of gravity, but children and old men and profane persons and priests were all slain in the same manner. The flame was also carried a long way and made an echo, together with the groans of those that were slain. Nor can one imagine anything either greater or more terrible than this noise. Moreover, many, when they saw the fire, exerted their utmost strength and did break out into groans and cries. Yet was the misery itself more terrible than this disorder, for one would have thought that the hill itself, on which the temple stood, was seething hot, as full of fire on every part of it, that the blood was larger in quantity than the fire, and those that were slain more in number than those that slew them. For the ground did nowhere appear visible, for the dead bodies that lay on it. The burning of the temple is especially significant in that the very date on which it was burned by the armies of Titus was the same date that Nebuchadnezzar had burned it centuries before. This seems like more than an accident. And I quote, "But as for that house, Elohim had for certain long ago doomed it to the fire. And now that fatal day was come. According to the revolution of the ages, it was the 10th of the month of Av, upon which it was formerly burnt by the king of Babylon." Unquote. As the temple burned, the Jews knew all hope for deliverance was gone. The aqueducts and the city sewers were crowded as the last place of refuge for the hopeless. When these were searched, 2,000 people were found dead there, and those that yet remained alive were dragged from thence and slain. The scriptures had warned, "And Yahweh shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships by the way whereof I speak unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondsmen and bondswomen, and no man shall buy you." Deuteronomy 28:68. Josephus tells how those that survived were led away captive, some being taken to Egypt. As for the rest of the multitude that were above 17 years old, he put them into bonds and sent them to the Egyptian mines, and sold the rest of the multitude with their wives and children, as every one of them at a low price. And that because such were sold were so very many, and buyers so few. Unquote. There were 97,000 that were sold as slaves, and 1,100,000 people that perished during the fierce tribulation of those days. Quote, "Now the number of those that were carried captive during the whole war was collected to be 97,000, as was the number of those that perished in the whole siege, 1,100,000, the greater part of whom were indeed of the same nation, but not belonging to the city itself, for they were come up from all the country to the feast of unleavened bread, and were on a sudden shut up by an army. The multitude of those that therein perished exceeded all the destruction that either man or Elohim ever brought upon the world." Josephus summed it up in these words, quote, "I shall therefore speak my mind here at once briefly, that neither did any city suffer such miseries, nor did any age ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness than this was from the beginning of the world. Sound familiar? Josephus says the calamities that befell the Jews were the greatest of all those, not only that they had been in our times, but in a manner of those that ever were heard of. Both of those wherein cities have fought against cities, or nations against nations. It appears to me that the misfortunes of all men from the beginning of the world, if they be compared to these of the Jews, are not so considerable as they were. The scholarly Christian translator of Josephus' works mentions this in a footnote, that these calamities of the Jews, who were our Savior's murderers, were to be the greatest that had ever been since the beginning of the world. Our Savior had directly foretold in the passages I read at first, and that they proved to be such accordingly. Josephus is here a most authentic witness. Concerning our Master's statement about unparalleled tribulation that was to come upon the Jews, Bochner has well said, there have been, of course, other periods of tribulation or suffering in which greater numbers of people were involved, and which continued for longer periods of time. But considering the physical, moral, and religious aspects, suffering never reached a greater degree of awfulness and intensity than in the siege of Jerusalem, nor have so many people ever perished in the fall of any other city. We think of the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima as causing the greatest mass horror of anything in modern times. Yet only about 1/10 as many people were killed in Hiroshima as in the fall of Jerusalem. Add to the slaughter of such a great number the bestiality of Jew to Jew and of Roman to Jew, and the anguish of a people who knew that they were forsaken of Elohim, and we see the justification for Messiah's words, for then shall be great tribulation, such as hath not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, nor ever shall be. When Yahshua spoke of tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world, nor ever shall be, it seems he was using a proverbial form of expression. Similar expressions are found in various ways in the Scriptures. Concerning the plague of locusts that devoured Egypt, for example, we read that, before them there were no such locusts as they, neither after them shall be such. Elohim said to Shlomo, I will give thee riches and wealth and honor, such as none of the kings have had before thee, neither shall there any after thee have the like. And there was none like thee before thee, neither after thee shall any arise like unto thee. And I will do in thee that which I have not done, and whereunto I will not do any more the like. Joel spoke of a great people. There hath not been ever the like, neither shall be any more after it, even to the years of many generations. Daniel wrote of a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And in the historical writings of the Maccabees we read, there was a great affliction in Israel, the like whereof was not since the time that a prophet was seen among them. Some might argue that there's been greater tribulation since 70 A.D. They could also argue that there have been kings that have had more wealth and honor than Shlomo. But such arguments are not merely differences in interpretation. They become arguments against the Bible itself. See how this expression was used in the Scriptures? We should not attempt to press it beyond its intended meaning. We believe the historical fulfillment fully meets the requirements of the prophecy that Yahshua gave in this connection. Yahshua again, for then shall be great tribulation, Matthew. For there shall be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, Luke. Did great tribulation or distress come upon the Jews and that land? Yes. Was Jerusalem trodden down of the Gentiles and destroyed, so that one stone was not left upon another? Yes. Was there great wrath, affliction, and distress upon that people? Yes. When Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, he spoke of the Jews who both killed the Master Yeshua and their own prophets, and have persecuted us to fill up their sins always, for the wrath is to come upon them to the uttermost.
The word translated uttermost here is the same word that is used in Matthew 24:6 and 17, where it is translated end. The word wrath that is used in this passage is the same as the one used in Luke 21:23, wrath upon this people. An arch was erected in Rome to commemorate the victory of Titus and the Roman armies in the destruction of Jerusalem. 700 of the Jewish captives were reserved by Titus to follow the carriage in which he made his triumphal entry into Rome. Carried in the procession were the spoils taken from the temple, the golden table, the menorah, the veils of the sanctuary, and the book of the Torah. These things are sculptured on the Arch of Titus in Rome. This monument has been a witness through the centuries to the fact that the words of Yahshua were fulfilled concerning the tribulation and destruction that was to come upon Jerusalem and Judea. The prophecy that Yahshua gave continues with these words, "And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be rescued. But for the elect's sake, those days have been shortened." We must bear in mind that the reference here is to the area upon which the tribulation of those days fell, Judea and Jerusalem. It should not be wrested from its proper setting. Concerning the destruction that came upon this same land and city in the Old Testament, we read, "Your country is desolate, your cities are burned with fire, your land strangers devour in your presence, and it is desolate. Except Yahweh of hosts had left unto us a very small remnant, we should have been as Sodom, and we should have been like Gomorrah." From Isaiah 1. With the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, of course, there was no flesh saved alive. It was total destruction. There is an obvious similarity here. In the Old Testament, except Yahweh had left a remnant, no flesh would have been rescued alive. In the New Testament, except the Master had shortened the days, there would be no flesh be saved alive. The meaning is the same in both cases. We will notice in more detail later that the destruction that came upon the land and people was the judgment of Elohim. It was no mere accident that things happened the way they did. The tribulation had definite bounds. However, it could only continue for a limited period of time. The days, we are plainly told, have been shortened. The Gentile armies could only go so far. Looking at Luke's account of the days of vengeance and great distress in the land and wrath upon this people, we read, "Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles." Now, who were the Gentiles that did this? It was Titus and his armies. And how long were they to tread it down? Until the times of the Gentiles, that is, Titus and his armies, be fulfilled. In other words, only a certain length of time was allotted for them to carry out the work of judgment, or, as Matthew and Mark put it, the days had been shortened. Some have pulled these 5 words, the times of the Gentiles, out of their setting and have attempted to stretch them into a long age of time for which there is no real proof in this passage. One noted writer of the dispensational school says, "The times of the Gentiles covers the entire period during which the nation of the Jews, the city of Jerusalem, and the land of Palestine are under Gentile domination. This begins with Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Palestine and will end at the revelation of the Lord Jesus Christ from heaven at the close of the Great Tribulation." This is the teaching set forth in the notes of the spurious Scofield Bible. But considering the setting, this verse about the times of the Gentiles is not talking about who is ruling Jerusalem. It's talking about Jerusalem being trodden down. It's not talking about long ages of time, but of Jerusalem being trodden down by Gentiles, the Gentiles being those that destroyed it in 70 AD, Titus, Flavius, and his armies. And it was no exaggeration when Yeshua spoke about no flesh being saved alive in that land upon which his judgment came. Josephus informs us that the populace was almost annihilated. There was no part of Judea which did not partake of the calamities of the capital city. But for the elect's sake, those days were shortened. The times allotted the Gentile armies to inflict that tribulation were limited. Though the Christians and the Nazarenes and the Ebionites had escaped into the mountains, that is of Pella, as you can learn in a recent exposition of the flight to Pella, living living without housing or provisions, they too could have eventually been destroyed by sword or famine if those days of tribulation had not been shortened.
And that is the end of this essay. It was written by Ralph Woodrow of the Ralph Woodrow Evangelistic Association from the site ralphwoodrow.org and used by permission. That's the best roundup of quotes and explanations of this event I have ever heard. And now you've heard it too.
Here is an interesting comment on Hal Lindsey's site. As you know, Hal Lindsey, longtime futurist, every 3 years story changes. This comes in from reader of Hal Lindsey. He say, I have friend in Florida who's an ultra-conservative conspiracy nut who believes that United Nations is the Antichrist tool to bring the whole world under his thumb. He say, all efforts should be made to keep the UN from taking over America. But he's also a dispensationalist who believes in the imminent return of Christ. That means right now, in this time. I once asked him why he wasn't supportive of Antichrist's rise to power. Why should I be? He asked. I replied, because if your conspiracy theory is correct, this is fulfillment of prophecy. Why not help things along and usher in return of Christ? All your efforts to oppose the Antichrist are simply delaying Jesus' return. Oh, how does he answer that? I had him genuinely conflicted, confused, and befuddled. If he were an animated character, smoke, steam, and sprockets would have come out of his ears. All of this was, of course, an attempt to show how inconsistent his position was. Very good. That goes for Great Tribulation, too. We should pray that Yahweh send it right now. If that is fulfillment of prophecy that brings Messiah return. And if these fellows are right, then it all be over soon. They say, Christ come in middle of 7 year. Then what we worry about? We hide out for 3.5 years, and probably in that time nobody find us down in the root cellar. That be good, then Christ come, take us up in air, and let the world go to hell. What do we care? No, it is important to learn that these things have already come, and that Yahweh has given a man the pen of a scribe to describe to us exactly how. And that man is Josephus ben Matthias. In 19th century, some Bible publishers were very smart because they published Josephus' war right after Revelation. So people see that Yochanan and Josephus is writing about same thing. They should still do that, I think, but since Schofield Bible come out with all that wild speculation, they're not making any money anymore on that. There are prophecies yet to unravel. This one is unraveled. Let us go and find prophecies that not come true yet, like 4th Esdras, like 2nd Baruch, like Ezekiel 40 through 44, and let us figure those out, because those are pertinent to our time. And millennium time coming up, oh, 7th day, millennium, well, Brother Snyder think that already starts in 6,000 years past already. Okay, so I am looking for signs of this. He showed me some. He talked about little flock of people that see Yeshua coming in clouds of concealment, coming to the little flock that will recognize him. Now, that's where I want to be, and that is why I am working so hard with Jackson Snyder Presents on Hebrew Nation Radio. When I go to church, the Ukrainian, Polish, Orthodox Church, a presumptuous assumption of the guiding light,
I come away scared because every time I go in, I am expected to say a sinner prayer and be scared to death with threats of devil and be made to cry remembering all the suffering of Messiah. And week after week after week, I tell you, it's brainwashing to me. And I'm thinking of going ahead and staying on this radio broadcast, even though I have been threatened there that I miss purgatory and go straight to hell if I stay here by Pastor Creamley. And then there's the part about spiritual adultery, and he remember where he leave bicycle, and that's the last time I saw him. He left there in hurry. But I still haven't made up my mind fully on it. I've been in Polish, Ukrainian, Orthodox, Catholic, Church of Presumptuous Assumption and Guiding Light for many, many years. This is where my family from, and there are not many of these left, I tell you. And, I'm going to be cut off from friends. If they kick me out, my friends won't like me anymore. If I go fully with this Hebrew root Essene thing, which I tell you is like a godsend, actually, but I'm trying to weigh the pros and cons on this thing of quitting church. There's a heritage there. I'm saying grandma go, mama go, and then, communists shut down that church. And it be closed for a long time, but I feel it part of my Ukrainian heritage to go. I've been going many years, more than most people been alive, but look, these things that they teach me are deeply ingrained in me now, and it's very hard to tear away, even though I recognize now that what they tell me and what they've been beating into my head for years is nothing but pagan myth. I wish somebody that had been through this could help me out here, give me some suggestion what to do. At least I know that great tribulation is past, and that I have nothing to fear from that, but there's still this lingering feeling that if I leave salvation of the church, then I do be going to hell, and I don't want to make big mistake. Oh, woe is me sometime, until I get on this radio microphone and hear encouraging message from those people in the Vero Essene, my new friends. There are not too many, I can tell you that. About as many as in the Ukrainian, Polish, Orthodox, Catholic Church of the Presumptuous Assumption and the Guiding Light. But the movement is growing every day, and we are out there every day trying hard to change hearts and minds, saying like John Baptist and Yeshua, shuv, 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 turn back, change mind. You have a heavenly Father if you love him, keep your commandments. I know this will all be resolved soon because I have good friends on Facebook now helping me. If you be my friend on Facebook, please do. My name is Boden Shrumkov. That's BOGDAN SCHRUMKOFF. Yes, I know. My first name in Ukrainian, Bogdan, means God's man. Bogo is the Ukrainian God. It almost seems strange now to pray, Dear Heavenly Father, Bogo. Yes, well, I told that story one time. I don't want you to think I'm that old and senile. This is your host. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed our variety show, Jackson Snyder Presents. This is a presentation of the Vero Essene Yahad in Vero Beach, Florida. If you would like more information about today's broadcast, email jackson@HebrewNation.net or visit HebrewNationOnline.com. Until we meet again, may Yahweh keep you safe and close to home.